The Year of the Young Reader, the American Booksellers Association Convention and Trade Exhibit, recorded June 2nd through 6, 1989 in Washington, D.C. Tip number 27, program entitled Looking Ahead, Isaac Asimov on the Future of the Book.
I'm Nancy Evans of Doubleday, and I think you couldn't have made a better choice in inviting Isaac Asimov to speak on the future of publishing. He does have impeccable credentials for that task. He is, after all, the man who has written published 424 books, which seems that total has gone up from what I came into the room with, because I double-checked with Isaac, and he's already written a few last night. But that's 424 books. If any of you have ever written a book or tried to write a book, you know that it takes great faith, great courage to write even one book, because you've got to believe that first of all, that you've got something important enough to say, to set words down on paper, and that there are enough people out there who want to hear your message. So I would think that Isaac, having written that many books, doesn't have just faith in the publishing process of writer to reader, but seems to have more of a religious calling, a mission that words really count. And I think that says something about the future of book publishing. Another credential he has, particularly in an era when we all read about authors jumping from publisher to publisher for the largest advance or the glitziest party or whatever it might be, I think it's even more wonderful to hear another record in the Isaac Asimov record book, which is that it just happens that it was tomorrow, June 6th, 40 years ago, that Isaac signed his first contract with Doubleday for his first book, Pebble in the Sky. And he has, of course, published with many other publishers as well, but he is hallowed in the halls of Doubleday, where he is on the premises every week, and he sings songs to the women of Doubleday. Another credential he has, given that we are here at the ABA, is that it was Isaac who immortalized the ABA when he wrote Murder at the ABA, which we should be handing out here. He is, after all, the master of science fiction. He does know something about the future. He's not bad at the present or the past either, but he does have a vision of the future. And I think in his future there are books, and I hope there are more books from Mr. Asimov, Isaac Asimov.
Thank you, Nancy. Actually, I have published 107 books now with Doubleday, and I think this is the only case in which a publisher has done over 100 books of a particular author and managed to publish only a minority of his books. But I might say that in my 40 years with Doubleday, not only have I never had a cross word with them, but I have never had occasion to feel mistreated in any way. They've been very good to me, and ever since Nancy Evans has become president, they've even been better, for goodness sakes. I wouldn't have thought it possible. But the books look better, they are better promoted, or whatever. In any case, I'm enjoying it. And I also have an editor, Jennifer Brell, who's just about one of the smartest women in the field. And she happens to be beautiful, too, which is a side issue. And irrelevant, you might say, but I just happen to notice it. Anyway, the question is books and the future, and I must tell you, I started thinking about the future of books back in 1972, I believe, when I was sitting in the audience when a gentleman was explaining how television was going to replace the book. He had two large two large devices, into one of which you put some sort of cassette, and it played in the other one. And he pointed out that it would be now possible to produce television works that would be suitable for a rather small minority of the public if they wished. If you want to know how to play chess, why then you have a little cassette on chess playing with animated chessmen and all that, and if you're interested, you get a copy. And if you're not interested, you get something else. But you don't have to settle only for what some huge chain, some huge network is going to put out for you, designing it for the least common denominator. So he said, eventually, everybody will be turning out neat little packages for television instead of these messy, dirty manuscripts, and people like Isaac Asimov will starve to death. At which the entire audience laughed gleefully at the thought of Isaac Asimov starving to death. And I was worried. I must admit I was. But that was back in 1972, which was 17 years ago. And in those 17 years, I'm glad to be able to tell you, I have brought into various publishers, including Doubleday, no fewer than 300 dirty, messy manuscripts to publish. And there's no signs as yet that I'm going to starve to death. If I can hold out just a few more years, the whole problem will become moot. But what will the future of books be? And I thought books were safe as long as they had those two huge instruments on the stage. I said nobody is going to replace them. We're going to replace books with those bulky pieces of furniture. But then I thought, you know, technology advances, and indeed it has. Right now, I only have one bulky instrument in my living room. It's called a television set, and underneath it I have a discrete little box into which I can place TV cassettes, and I can watch movies if I wish. And I do on occasion. I still get ordinary movies. I don't get advice on how to play chess or a little section on the Alaskan moose or any of the other things that might interest me. But it's obvious that there's still room for further improvements. For instance, you want the object to become smaller and smaller. You don't want it necessarily big. If you make it smaller and smaller until it's portable. After all, you have these portable radios. Why not have a portable television set into which you can put a little cassette and you can carry it around with you to your treehouse if you wish, or in the bathroom, or wherever. Naturally, I can just see this long wire that you've got attached to the wall plug. So what you want is a battery run affair so that you don't have to plug it in anywhere. And naturally, in these days of being very aware of energy wastage, you would want a battery that would last for a long time and that could make it do with very small power inputs. And ideally, when there's no energy output at all, somehow just have the thing run itself with zero energy. And of course, what about the controls? I mean, forever having to push something and push something else and make it louder or adjust the contrast or the color or whatever. Well, naturally, you want controls as simple as possible. One little dial to do the whole business. You turn it on and adjust it. And maybe preferably, if we're going to go far enough into the future, you can get one that's run by your will alone. I mean, if you wanted to move along, you move it along. If you want to fast forward it, you move it along faster. If you want to backtrack, you have it go backwards. Everything by just an exercise of the will. Stop it when you wish, and start it the next day again. Or go back from the beginning if you've forgotten. In other words, I'm looking into the future to see the television set of the future. One which is portable, which uses no energy, which has no controls other than your will, and which is private. Because you don't want people watching your stuff. You want one which only you can see, only you can hear, and it's entirely your own. Like a Sony Walkman, for instance. And now the question is, when the devil are we going to get a television set which is small and portable, which uses zero energy, which is run by the will, which can be started, stopped, made to go forward and backward, and which is completely private? When are we going to have that? Now the answer is in exactly minus 5,000 years. Because what I've just described to you is a book, which is precisely what I've said. It's small and it's portable, it uses zero energy, it's entirely your own, you don't share it with anyone necessarily, and you can flip the pages forward or back, you can stop reading anytime you want, you can start reading anytime you want. There is nothing as convenient as a book, and there never will be anything as convenient as a book. There may be other things, but none quite as convenient. And you say to me, perhaps, but you've left out something very important. A television set has images, and a book doesn't. Now, in the first place, let's not overestimate this business of images. We are used to receiving information by eye. Probably 90% of all the information that we get in the universe is by eye. On the other hand, eye will not substitute for the ear when it comes to important forms of information. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. If you turn off the picture on the television set, darken it so that you don't see a picture, but you hear the conversation, you can usually gather what's going on. If, on the other hand, you leave the picture on and deaden the sound, you haven't the faintest idea what's going on. You can make do with sound without vision, as far as that kind of information is concerned, easier than you can do with vision without sound. This is particularly true in advertising. You almost never see advertising which doesn't have words plastered all over it. I mean, I'm talking about television, not newspapers. And yet, notice, when they have words plastered all over the advertisements, those words are always read by the announcer. You will never see the words there, no matter how simple they are, just allowing the viewer to read it. It is read by the announcer, and this brings up the other point, which is, if books are so much better than anything else, why is it that it is a minority activity? And the answer is that reading is harder than we think. We are all book people here. We have all been reading since we were little kids. We find that it's not difficult. We can read easily, effortlessly, and quickly. There's no trouble involved at all. And so naturally we think that that's the way it is. But that's not the way it is. And I found this out once long ago on the subways of New York when I found myself without anything to read. I had an hour trip from my home to Columbia. 1 hour, and I had nothing to read. I was hanging from the strap, and all I could do was stare. And then I realized that a young lady sitting directly in front of me was reading a comic book. Well, listen, anything is better than nothing. And fortunately, I can read as easily upside down as right side up. So I leaned over and read the comic magazine with her. And when I was finished with a page, I waited for her to turn the page. And I waited, and and I waited, and I suddenly realized why people buy comic books. Because I used to go into these magazine racks, and if I saw a comic book that I particularly well liked, like a Scrooge McDuck, for instance, why, I would take it out and casually read it. It wouldn't take me long, and I would casually put it back. And there was 15 cents saved, you know? And I used to wonder in my artless way why everyone didn't do that, why anyone bothered to buy a copy. And I realized that many people, it was the work of an hour or two to read the book, and they couldn't stand there that long without attracting attention. Now, when you stop to think of it, when you write, you translate every word in the English language into a wiggly line. Now, you don't realize it's a wiggly line. You're making letters. You're thinking of it as letters. If you write C-A-T, C-A-T. But to someone who doesn't know the language, it's just a wiggly line. Just as if you don't know Chinese, those ideographs look like randomly drawn little messy things. Well, now, every single word has a different wiggly line. And you have to know the wiggly line for your entire vocabulary. Even if you hear a word that you've never heard before and didn't know was an English word, you go by the sound and you make a wiggly line that represents that sound as nearly as you can tell. Now, you think it's easy to work up a wiggly line for every single different word and to write it real fast? Now think of what reading means. It means you have to look at all these wiggles and convert them into words and do it as fast as your eye moves across the page. When you think of it that way, that is such a difficult task that you begin to be surprised that you can do it. And yet you can. And many people can't. Even people who are literate and who can, if they have to, slowly write something, can't do it easily, can't do it effortlessly, can't do it quickly. And the result is that most people try to avoid it. Now, it's no use expecting everybody to read books. It's just too hard a job. So that reading has always been a minority activity. And it may always be a minority activity. Nobody is ever going to make as much money out of a book, minus a few people like Stephen King, as you can make out of a movie, even a lousy movie. But, of course, there are advantages to writing books too. If you write a book and get 100,000 people to read it, you've got it made. You're going to have a good return on your book, and you're even going to be famous in a very limited way. On the other hand, if you make a movie, you've got to have at least 10 million people watch it if you want even to break even, so that you really have to go for the lowest common denominator. So that we end up with a thought that books are a minority activity, and then we say, why should anyone read then? If it's so much easier to watch television, why should anyone bother reading books? It's my thesis that not only do some people read books, but they would rather read books than watch television, even if they enjoy television. It never turns out to be as good as a book. And here's why, in my opinion. When you watch a television program, let us say, and that is these days the great competitor of books. Don't think it's the only competitor. For goodness sakes, don't think that before television came in, everybody was reading. They weren't. And if suddenly every television set on earth disappeared, the people who watch television would sit and stare at an empty spot on the wall rather than read. But if we consider television, then what it does is present everything. You see the people. You hear their voices. You follow the intonation of those voices. You get background music to tell you what emotions to feel. You get the entire background, the the house, the furnishings, the fields, the trees, whatever it is. And everyone gets exactly the same thing. You have, if 20 million people are watching, 20 million passive receptacles. The top of the skull is lifted off, and into the brain is poured the complete works. Everyone gets exactly the same thing. All 20 million can then discuss this particular program they had on television. They've all seen the same people. They've all heard the same voices. They've all seen the same background and intonations and everything else. There's really nothing to talk about. On the other hand, if you can imagine a book that 20 million people will read, the book gives them the absolute minimum. All they get are these mysterious markings, which they can only translate into words, nothing else. There is no image. You don't see what the people look like. You don't hear their intonations. You don't see the background. All you get are words and nothing else. Does that sound impoverished? Does that sound as though you're being cheated? Does that sound as though you're being shortchanged? Quite the reverse. The images are there in your head. Nobody has ever read a book who's in the least bit literate, has ever read a book without imagining everything that's going on in this exciting novel. You imagine the people, you imagine their voices, you imagine the intonations, you imagine all the background that's described to you. You've got your own images, your own book. If 20 million people read the same book, they react in 20 million different ways. They see all the characters in their own way. Who knows what they look like to any individual person? They hear voices their own way. They see backgrounds their own way. And if the 20 million people want to talk about the books, they are talking about 20 million different books. And they can advance their feelings and listen to yours. And you can never, never, never get tired of it. The books demand that you contribute. You are no longer a passive receptacle. You are not having everything under the sun poured into your head. You are being given the minimum, and you are being asked to supply everything else. You are participating in a work of art. They talk about participatory television. You're going to tell them what to do. Well, you're participating with every word of a book. You've got something no one else has got. That book is not only what the writer writes, it is what you bring to it. It involves your own attitudes, your own experience. And some books that appeal to something in you may be considerably enriched by your contribution to it. And you find more in the book than perhaps the writer knows he put in. Some perhaps you get less out of than the writer tried to put in. But you, after all, read a lot of books, and the ones that you enjoy, the ones to which you contribute, are the ones you're likely to read over and over again and never get tired of. And you ask yourself, why should you want to read a book that you've read before? We all do. My own personal record is Pickwick Papers, which I read when I was a little kid first, and I've read it by actual count 26 times. I know it by heart. You can open it up anywhere you want and read 3 lines, and I'll tell you what came before and what came after. Why on earth should I then, every once in a while, sit down and reread it? And the answer is because 3 more years have passed. 3 more years have changed in me. 3 more years I've learned something. 3 more years I've had more experience. I bring a little something different to the book. It has changed slightly. and I enjoy it in a new way. There is nothing that will ever substitute for the book. Producing the book is different. You can produce it in many different ways. When I heard this talk in 1972, I used a typewriter. Now I use a word processor. I still print it up and hand in a manuscript. It's a lot cleaner than it used to be. Maybe someday I, or more likely younger writers than I, won't hand in manuscripts, will hand in floppy disks. Maybe someday some other form of technology will further ease the transmission of books from the mind of the writer to whatever device it is used to insert it into the mind of the reader. But these are details. 5,000 years when the book was invented, it consisted of hardened clay on which cuneiform markings were made. The oldest piece of important fiction that we know, I'm not talking about laundry lists, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which probably goes back to at least 2500 BC, maybe a little earlier. It was not on anything that resembles a book as we think of it. In ancient times, in ancient Greece, we had rolls of papyrus. The word volume is still from the Latin word to roll. And then, of course, we had manuscripts, handwritten. Then we developed printing. Also, this is the outer clothing. The essential body is still the words transmitted from the writer to the reader. And there will never, never be anything better than that, because it represents the minimum information you can have, and therefore the maximum interaction you can have. Now, if I could look forward 5,000 years, and I could be pretty certain that nobody would ever hand in a piece of manuscript again, nevertheless, the book would exist. Whatever competition would arise, the book would still exist. Whatever people might do, the book would still exist. However much the majority would prefer something else, that small minority, which finds reading simple and effortless, will not exchange it. We of the book world deal with minorities, but it's the most faithful minority that ever lived. They cannot abandon us, because there's nothing that can replace us. And we can spend the rest of history, for as long as humanity, it consists of thinking beings, the rest of history supplying humanity with the thing that the best people want most. And even if it means none of us will ever get as rich in money as we would if we were Hollywood, nevertheless, all of us can feel we have done something that will last forever and for which people will be grateful forever. Thank you very much. If there are any questions anyone wants to ask, either on the topic of the talk or on anything related or unrelated, please. Yes?
Do you think that the size of this minority will ever expand or contract? Has it always been the same proportion of society?
Well, do I think that the size of this minority will contract or expand? That has always been the same proportion. I think it has expanded in historical times for the simple reason that books have become more available. Until the printing press was invented, books were rare objects indeed. They had to be copied over. And an edition, quote unquote, of 100 copies represented a major investment in time. And individual books were so valuable that they would chain them in place. A person who had a library of 100 books was a phenomenon. Well, obviously, in a society in which books were rare and literacy was rare too, you're going to have very few people who can read books even when they can read books. I mean, I read a biography of Chaucer, for instance. It was almost impossible for him to get a copy of Boccaccio, from which he took some of his plots. Because where are you going to find one? Someone had one. You'd travel hundreds of miles to take a look at it in his place. You couldn't expect to keep it. So that once you had the printing press and books came out all over the place and the Industrial Revolution came and it was important to have an educated public because they're going to handle the machinery, well, naturally it goes up. So that probably we have a larger minority reading books now than ever before in history. Whether it can expand any further is doubtful, because about as many people can read, as percentage-wise, as are likely to, and books are about as available as they're ever likely to be. So now it's not a case of people not reading because they can't physically get the book or they can't physically get the education. It's because they simply don't want to. So I think from here on in, it may be that the minority will not increase tremendously. Yes, sir.
What do you think about the tradition of oral storytelling and talking and using tapes to transmit verbal stories to people who can't read?
Well, as a matter of fact, there was a time, the question is what I think about the practice of the telling of oral stories on tapes of people who can't read. Of course, there was a time in an illiterate society where the bard was a great man, where the bard was the television set of the time, when you sat around while he sang of the fall of Troy. And he did it by memorizing parts, by learning how to improvise, and so on. It's a great thing if a guy has his lyre and can keep company and has a mellifluous voice, and so on. But the opportunities to listen to this are about on the par with the opportunity of seeing a circus. It's when they come. And usually, usually the bars are for the aristocrats, the guys who can afford to sit around and listen, so that you get the Iliad and the Odyssey, which have an aristocratic bias. I mean, it's all about these semi-heroes. If they mention the lower classes, it's unfavorably. Nowadays, of course, things are different. Nowadays, you have an actual sub-form of the literary art, where you can enjoy people reading a book. Now, it's not just a matter of reading then. You have to have the ability of the artist, the actor. I have read my own books into a recording device and then listened to the result. Now, I can read just as easily as anyone in the world, and barring a certain New York accent that I have, I can enunciate as reasonably as anyone in the world. But it's pitiful listening to myself read. What you want is an actor's voice, which I simply don't have. It's not rich enough, it's not resonant enough, it's not deep enough. For goodness sakes, it's no disgrace that I'm not as pretty as a movie actor. It's no disgrace that I can't sing as well as an opera singer. Why should it be a disgrace that I can't read as well as, say, Laurence Olivier could? So, again, you would want reading done by someone who can read well, and there aren't very many who can. And listening to somebody read not well is not something people enjoy, whether they know it or not. So that, again, that's where the book has the advantage, because you have copies of a particular book. Any one that you pick up is like any other, and you can read it just as well. Whereas in this oral telling, you can't substitute voices. You need a good voice. Yes, sir.
How long did you switch over to word processor? How has it affected your output?
Well, I switched over in 1980, and it wasn't my idea. I'd reached the point where it didn't matter if my manuscripts were messy. My publisher simply bit the bullet. But a computer magazine called me up and asked me if I would please write an article on myself and my computer. And I said, I can't. I don't have a computer. What? They said, you don't have a computer? I said, I'm sorry, I don't. I use a typewriter. 1 week later, I had a computer. They had Radio Shack send me in a TSR 80, TRS 80, with a scriptset software, and I learned how to use it, the most miserable month of my life. Brought in 2 telephone books of instructions, which I couldn't understand. They sent people out twice. It bounced off me. Finally, at the end of 29 days, I said, I'm going to make one more attempt, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to throw it out the window. And the set heard me and began to work. Now I can use it fine, just enough to turn out my manuscripts. There's some things that I'm sure it can do that I don't know how to make it do, like repaginate. I haven't the faintest idea how one repaginates. So what I do is every time I write a page, that's it. I go on to the next page and I never look back. I had to make exponents, you know, x square. So I turned to my big telephone books and I looked up exponents. Couldn't find exponents. I went through the whole goddamn thing, studied the index, no exponents. I called up Radio Shack. I said, how do I make an exponent? They say, well, doesn't it say in your book? No, I said, never mentions exponents. They said, have you tried superscript? So I looked it up and I fooled them. Not only can I make superscripts now, but I also learned how to make subscripts. But that's the last thing I learned on that damn thing. So anyway, this is the way it's changed my life. Short pieces get done faster because I only type it once. And when I used the typewriter, I would type it up, then I'd go over it, and I'd be bound to make some corrections in between the lines, and then just to have it minimally neat, I would type it up again and go over it and make far fewer corrections and hand that in. Now, I do it directly in the word processor and edit each page as I do it, correcting all the mistakes and never looking back. So I figure it takes me a little more than half the time. It's a little different for novels, books, and long pieces where I cannot do without the sheets of paper. I am not going to sit around and try to figure out on which floppy disk this is and try to locate it and try to make and maybe make changes that'll then throw all the pages out and stuff like that there. So I do it on the typewriter still, and I get my stack of paper, which I can refer to very easily. I then type it a second time into the word processor. So I don't save much time on long pieces, but the stuff that comes out is a lot cleaner. And this somehow magically suggests to the editors that the quality is higher. I'm just kidding. And so on. Yes, ma'am.
If not everyone can be expected to read, what implications does that have for
Ah, well now, I don't say that only a minority of people can read. I'm saying a minority prefer reading to any other form of spectator sport, like watching television. But even the people who watch television can, in a pinch, read and maybe get something out of it. And I would say that education has as its goal that of getting as many people as possible to learn how to read and write, and persuading as many people as possible to take advantage of that as much as possible. And even those who don't want to take very much advantage of it are really better off than if they were completely illiterate and couldn't take advantage of it. So remember, when I'm speaking about the small minority, I'm not speaking about a small literate minority, but a small minority that is both literate and would rather have the written word than anything else in the world. Well, maybe not than sex, but yes, dear.
I think your science fiction has a wonderful staying power over the years. What do you see in the future for scientific writing, or not scientific, science fiction, futuristic kind of writing?
Well, I'll have to tell you, what do I see in the future for science fiction, for futuristic kinds of writing. I must tell you, I'm the wrong person to ask that because I'm stuck in the 40s and 50s. We are all creatures of our own time. I learned my way through science fiction. I had my training in it in the 30s. And then in the 40s and 50s, I improved on what I had read, and I advanced beyond it. But now I'm stuck there. The stuff I write now, I could just as easily have written in the 40s and 50s, and this is commented upon sometimes by unkind critics who are not telling me anything I don't know, and I resent they're telling that to other people who might not realize it if they didn't tell them. But ever since the 50s and the 60s and thereafter, there has been such a decline in fiction generally. I mean, when you stop to think of it, all the pulp fiction is gone. All the slicks hardly ever publish any fiction. Once in a while, that's all. The literary quarterlies are gone. Most publishers are not terribly interested in first novels. They want you to come out with your second novel to begin with. So that the young writers of today, and there are just as many ambitious young writers of today who 30, 40 years ago would have gone into anything rather than science fiction, because science fiction was the least regarded of all branches of fiction and the least well-paying, which is even more important. Now go into science fiction because it's one of the few flourishing branches of fiction. And as a result, they bring with them their own skills. And we get science fiction that's much closer to mainstream, which is told in experimental prose and highly poetic prose, in symbolic prose, and all kinds of things that I couldn't in a million years handle. And they get all the kudos and all the awards, and I'm sort of left in the back. I don't resent that. I know that I'm 40s and 50s and I've outlived my time. Fortunately, my books still sell because I have one thing that's left going for me, which is I write clearly. People read me and they don't have to break into a perspiration trying to understand what I'm getting across. I don't say that. It doesn't pay to work hard to try to see what the writer's getting. Maybe if you do work hard and get under the surface, you can come across layers and layers of symbolism and hidden meanings and all that sort of stuff and do yourself a lot of good. But for those people who want to save their energies and get something which they understand right off, why, I'm made to order for them, and enough of them exist so that I can make a living. And so, what the heck. Anyway, if you ask me about the future of science fiction, I can only say it ain't me. Yes, sir.
Some magazines now are going that direction. Try to get this information out faster. What do you see as the publishing house 10 years from now?
For that, you'll have to ask Nancy Evans, things like that. I don't know. I'm hoping that they don't come to me and say, Asimov, you must hand in your floppy disks. We cannot handle manuscripts anymore. I'll be in deep trouble if they say that. But I have a vision of the word going out. Okay, only floppy disks, no more manuscripts, except, of course, Asimov. Then that I'll live with. Is there someone else? Yes.
You don't seem to think much of comic books. How do you feel about using comic books to bring non-readers gradually into the world of books?
Oh, I didn't say I didn't think much of comic books. I was a great reader of comic books as an adult. I never read them as a kid because they didn't have them then. But as an adult, I read them all the time. And in fact, when I was teaching medical school, the medical students would whisper to each other, we just saw Dr. Asimov reading a comic magazine in the luncheonette or something. It didn't bother me any. There isn't a person in the world who's going to think I'm not intelligent, so I can do what I want. But I think that there are people who are more at home with comic magazines than with almost anything else. And if you want to reach them, you might as well reach them that way than not reach them at all. Furthermore, like everything else, there are all sorts of gradations of comic magazines, from some kind which are just the purest schlock, which is also true of science fiction and mainstream literature, to stuff which is well thought out, well drawn, and makes an intelligent use of a combination of illustration and words. And if you get that, there's nothing wrong with it. And if you reach the audience, why not? For instance, for some time in the early 80s, I wrote a monthly mystery story, 2,200 words long, for Gallery magazine. Gallery magazine is a girly magazine, something which I don't generally have in the house. And when they asked me to do it, I said, you understand, I don't write erotica. And they said, oh, we know that. So I said, do you mind not pasting on the other side of the page one of your photographs? Because I planned to cut out that and bind it and save it, and I hated cutting out and binding and saving also one of those pictures. I mean, tell you the truth, I know what they look like. So they try to oblige me, and people say, why do you do it? Well, the obvious answer is that they paid me more than say Ellery Queens would pay for me. And the second reason was that I would reach an audience I would have no chance of reaching any other way, and I might get them to say, hey, let's buy some more stuff by Asimov. Well, why shouldn't I? I figure it would be for my good and for their good, too. So I wrote it. Eventually, after 33 such stories, Gallery magazine got a new publisher who decided he didn't want to waste space on non-erotic mysteries. So I was let go, so to speak. But since then, I still write magazines of the same story, of the same series, but I sell it to Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine for 1/10 the sum. And I'm sort of relieved, you know, because now I don't have to explain to people why I appear there. It's worth the money to me not to have to explain. But there was a legitimate explanation for that, and for comic magazines, too. See, I always get back to it. Yes, ma'am?
In France, it's not that rare for a real book to sell 500,000 copies or even more. And the equivalent in terms of relative to population here would be 2 and 3 million copies, and which is rare to say the very least. And to what do you attribute that difference in the minority of real readers? And is there some way to increase it in the United States?
Well, you know, it's also true in the Soviet Union, I'm told. They put out a large number, and they're all sold the first day, and then they don't reprint. But to what I attribute, in the case of France, for instance, is they've got a long, long history of literacy. They are much more proud of their culture than we are. Here, it's no disgrace to know nothing about American literature. I imagine in France, somehow it's a disgrace not to know about French literature. I don't know this for sure. I've never studied it, but that's the feeling I get. The United States is a polyglot nation drawn from all sorts of places. If anything, right now we've gone too far with this ethnic Americanism bit. I mean, we've got in New York City, we've got every day of the year a parade of a different kind of Americans, you know. And I always figure, can't they save one day for Americans, and then I'll parade all by myself. Not that I was born in the United States. I was born in the Soviet Union, and I'm Jewish. But I don't make a big fetish about my roots. I was educated in the United States. My culture is that of the United States, and I don't want anything more. So I'm going to parade on American Day as soon as they establish it. I mean, if I love my roots so much, why did I leave? But never mind. Never mind. This is something that I feel strongly on, but I'm not in the mainstream, and you can mistake it. It begins to sound like super patriotism or being anti this or anti that, but it's not. It's just a feeling I have, and sometimes I can't suppress it. Yes, sir.
There are bookstores now that are designed specifically for children, and their books come in all sizes, forms, and sounds. Is this the right approach? Will this draw more young readers to the written word? Or is this the wrong approach?
No, I think that the younger you can start people, the better. I think that before children read, the parents should read to them. And not only read to them, there's the kid and there you are, should open the book and you should go along and read it so the kid gets the notion that there's something there that can be read. The kids memorize the books easily. You know, children's brains are marvelous, much more marvelous than ours are. You read them a story, they memorize it. You read it a second time and you say, and he was very, very sad. And they say, no, very, very, very sad. They want that third very, you know? And they will grow interested and learn to read by themselves almost. When I was a kid, my parents were immigrants. They could not read the English, or for that matter, they didn't even know the alphabet. They knew two languages perfectly, Yiddish and Russian, and neither one used the Roman alphabet. So they were completely helpless. And I was aware they couldn't read the street signs. And I was aware they couldn't read the signs, and so I asked the other kids what these signs meant. And the other kids, under protest, I had to keep after them and make a pest of myself, taught me the alphabet and what each letter sounded like, and I went out sounding. By the time I went into the first grade, I could read. It's not very difficult if you're motivated. I happen to be motivated. But my goodness, you should give the kid a chance. He may not be motivated by your doing this, but he may be. And he will learn to read more easily, and he may learn to like reading more. So that I think the time to begin is before he knows how to read. And the time and the thing to do is to make it a mutual event. You read together. You don't read to, and you don't just hand him a book for him to look at the pretty pictures. You read it to him. That's my feeling, but I'm not a child psychologist. I'm not nothing. Yes.
I was wondering if you could give me your impression of some other science fiction writers, specifically like Stanley Weinbaum and Frederick Brown and Clifford Simak. Those are three that I like.
They're all dead.
I know. Stanley G. Weinbaum is the most tragic of the three. He broke into the field in 1934 with The Martian Odyssey. It appeared in the least of the three magazines that then existed with absolutely no warning, and everyone fell in love with it because it was a story that tried to present an ecologically reasonable picture of an alien world. It did not just present monsters. It presented creatures that might conceivably live in a world that was chemically different, psychologically different, and so on. And for a space of a year and a half, he was all of a sudden the most successful and the most famous writer of science fiction. And then he died of cancer at the age of 36. He had an 18-month career. That's all. Philip K. Dick lived longer. And he wrote more too. And as I was saying on the train coming here, when he died, they dug up all sorts of books of his that either had been neglected or had never been published, and he became more popular after he died than he had been before. And I was feeling guilty because everything I've written, everything, is instantly published. There's nothing with which to surprise my public. Once I pass on, they're going to feel cheated. Cliff Simak is a person who wrote his first story in 1931, and who continued to write for over 50 years. And even past the age of 80, he was still turning out extremely good stuff. Age did not wither nor custom stale him. But then he died, as all of us must, at the age of 84, last year. And he was my wife's favorite writer. Listen, I modeled my style on his quite deliberately because I wanted a clear style cut to the bone with no fancy stuff, no poetry, no hard, and nothing hard to understand. Just make the writing as clear as a pane of the best window glass so you can look right through it and see what's behind it without being held up by the glass itself. Now, it's beautiful if you can write beautiful prose. Then you're looking at stained glass. You don't know what's on the other side, but you can admire the glass itself. I knew that I would never be able to produce stained glass. Next best is clear glass that you can see through. Now you say, yeah, but that's too easy. Not at all. We had stained glass in ancient times. Clear glass is a modern invention. It's much harder to do. So that's the way I think it is with me too. If writing simply and clearly is so easy, I'm surprised more people don't do it. And the answer is anyway, Simak wrote that way, and I decided that's the way I wanted to write. So there's those three you mentioned. Yes, ma'am.
Would you differentiate between science fiction and fantasy?
Oh dear. You know, everybody in science fiction has their own differentiation, their own definition of science fiction, their own definition of fantasy, and their own way of separating. I'll try my way. Okay. Science fiction and fantasy both deal with societies that are not our own. Science fiction deals with a society that might conceivably be our own, given scientific and technological changes that are conceivable. Fantasy does not require that. Fantasy is societies different from our own, even if we cannot convert ours to theirs by any form of scientific or technical change that we can consider reasonable. So that, you see, you get my stories of the future, that's science fiction. But you get Lord of the Rings, that's fantasy.
Thank you.
Okay. I think I have time for one more question. It's, wait, someone I haven't, yes?
Quick one. Do you value and admire and read avidly the stained glass writers with symbolism behind symbolism?
To be perfectly honest, I don't. The writers I do read, I value because they aren't obscure. Now, this doesn't mean that I lack the capacity to understand difficult things. I read nonfiction books on quantum mechanics. That's fine, provided they're clear. But my favorite authors are Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, Agatha Christie, P.G. Wodehouse. And every one of them is right there where you can understand what they're saying. You have no difficulty whatsoever. Well, I'm sorry. I don't say that it's not a pleasure to read works that require thought, that some people don't get a lot out of it. This is simply my own personal predilection, which I don't necessarily recommend to anyone else. Thank you all very much.
That concludes this program.